Howdy, everybody. Welcome to the very first. Well, hang on. Hey, everybody. My name is Mr. Hill. I'm your friendly neighborhood history teacher, and welcome to the very first episode of Wait a Minute in History with Mr. Hill. Now, after you've watched this one, if you want to see more of these, I should probably remove that. There we go. Then I'm probably going to ask you for the YouTube holy duumvirate of liking and subscribing. This episode, like so many others, is going to be sponsored by, shall we say, by the coronavirus pandemic currently sweeping the world. As you probably heard a reference to the Spanish flu in the last couple of weeks, and you'll undoubtedly come across it later, I thought this was a pretty good place to start. So, in the next brief couple of minutes, I'm going to give you three fact based statements about the previous pandemic, considered by many to be the worst pandemic of the modern era. A couple of myths along the way that didn't help anybody at all, and then to kind of look at a couple of critical differences between the two. That the Spanish flu of 1918 and the coronavirus epidemic of today. So, before we even get started, a little bit of a disclaimer. When we're talking about influenza and coronavirus, we're talking about two different things. Now, I'm not a medical professional, but the family of coronaviruses, which are causing respiratory illness right now, and the influenza viruses, which cause what we think of as the flu, are two completely separate things. The primary reason that you're hearing about them together is because of the global nature of the spread of the disease and because they were both called pandemics. One of the big reasons why people probably use the Spanish influenza, and we'll get to the term Spanish here in a minute, is because it was one of the first that had a lot of pictures, it had a lot of newspaper headlines, it had a lot of radio coverage, and so there's a whole lot of things for current social media to pull, and also for all of you meme creators to find plenty of pictures for it. So it's going to be in our kind of in the social zeitgeist for a little while. So without further ado, the 1918 influenza pandemic, colloquially known as Spanish flu, uh, it resulted in the infection of fully one-fifth of the world's population. Estimates range up to one-third. An estimated 50 million dead worldwide, and 27% of the population in the United States, or 675,000 people, that died at the time. It had the effect, in the United States at least, of reducing the average life expectancy by 12 years. So, along with a lot of different things, this was considered to be the most deadly virus in the modern era. And you say to yourself, wait a minute, Mr. Hill, so why are these being compared and why was this one so deadly? That's a really good question. Let me try and answer it a little bit. The first, it hit healthy people. So, diseases by their nature are opportunistic, and so therefore the vast majority of epidemics, pandemics, or even seasonal disease are going to hit people who are in vulnerable groups, 5 and below, 60 and up, along with immunocompromised and chronically ill. Those are the two highly impacted groups, and you'll hear about them a lot in the current pandemic. Those are highly impacted groups today. The strange feature of the 1918 influenza, which was an H1N1, and you heard that right. If you're having a little bit of flashback, there was a variant of H1N1 that we called swine flu back in 2009. And that was not the same thing, but a variant of the H1N1 influenza virus, which was also labeled a pandemic. This particular one in 1918 heavily impacted 20 to 40-year-olds, seemingly healthy people. And in fact, the 1918 pandemic, you were 20 times more likely to die from that influenza strain versus the seasonal influenza, which had already hit the globe, if you were a healthy person. There are a lot of theories behind this. Once again, I'm not making any claim to be a medical professional. However, it really didn't, there were a series of people that looked into this old influenza, the 1918 pandemic, as recently as 2009, and there are still theories as to why it was so deadly. But one of the reasons why it took so many lives was because it hit those populations which did not normally get hit, right? So the second fact that I'd like for you to think about as we're trying to compare these two is that there was no flu vaccine for general use until 1945. Now, the H1N1 strain that created the pandemic conditions of 1918, it was an outlier. It was novel. You've probably heard people use the term novel to talk about this coronavirus. It doesn't mean that it's the first coronavirus. It means it's a novel form. This was a novel form of influenza which hit in 1918. The vaccines which we know of today, the one that so many people go out and get every winter, are based upon influenza A and influenza B, which were both vaccines or both viruses which were identified in the 1930s, and then by about 1935, 1940, they figured out a way to grow that virus in chickens' eggs, which is today, by the way, still a way that we get a vast majority of our flu vaccine. By 1945, it was marketed by a group of doctors. The most notable you would remember would be Dr. Jonas Salk, also polio fame, was a part of that team. So I don't bring that up to say that getting a vaccine is going to change anything about coronavirus. That's not the case. In fact, they've talked about a vaccine. Many health professionals say if they can crack that, it would be well over a year away, a year and a half away, and it's not going to prevent a novel form of some sort of virus from doing exactly what's happening now. However, but the point is that when this particular previous pandemic hit, we were living in basically a pre-vaccine world, and a whole lot of medicine that we have today, a lot of preventive measures that we have today, we didn't have 102 years ago. So you're living in a world that doesn't have any of those kind of features that modern hospitals do. You really only had non-pharmaceutical remedies such as isolation, quarantine, good personal hygiene, limitation to public gatherings, and as many of you have probably already seen with the Port Aransas spring break pictures and other things, whenever you tell people to stay home, not everybody is going to stay home. So think about that as well. The third was that, and this is getting into why it was called the Spanish flu. Wartime censorship was going to skew the death from the flu and delay the response until it was already on the doorstep of most of the populous nations in the world, including the United States. And I'll give you this, and we'll probably delve into numbers about wartime deaths having to do with disease or combat later, but the Spanish flu, or the influenza of 1918, killed far more soldiers in fields of combat than actual combat. And so you have to understand the context of the time. 1918 was the closing year of the First World War. Okay, the Allies were doing well, morale was high, and when this kind of thing started to pop up in those wartime areas, they didn't need it. They didn't need to tell newspapers that there was some sort of mystery flu sweeping the front lines, and so they cracked down on all of the reports of anybody dying from flu, both soldiers and citizenry, anybody involved in active wartime efforts at that time. The one exception was the country of Spain, which was neutral during this conflict. And so as a result, they didn't have the same exclusionary embargoes on news, and they reported relatively accurately for the time that there were these skyrocketing numbers of cases. And not only it was old people and young people, but it was also healthy people between their 20s and 40s. And what really clinched it was when it was reported that King Alfonso XIII, the king of Spain at the time, also came down with this particular variant of flu. He got very ill. He did recover, but as I said before, 50 million others across the world didn't. So this kind of high infection rate in Spain, where it was only reported there, it was bolstered by other censors who were looking for a reason to describe this evolving, scary thing. And so they pointed at Spain and said, well, look, it's all over Spain. It must be a Spanish flu. So by the time it was reported accurately of any kind, it was already given that label, right? It was not a Spanish flu. It did not come from Spain. It was just that Spain honestly reported it at the time. That's something that we'll think about when we get into critical differences really quick. The critical differences between now and 1918 are that we live in a far more connected world. We have health agencies such as the CDC, founded in 1946, the WHO, founded in 1948, and many other health agencies which are specifically tasked with gathering and coordinating data on things like this from around the world. It was, in fact, the WHO country office in China that identified the first novel case of coronavirus back in December of 2019. We also live in a far cleaner world. The world of 1918 was without many of the cleaning and sterilizing chemicals, products, and processes that we have today. We live in a world that isn't currently involved in a global military conflict. While this by no means isolates us from poor news and media coverage, it does mean that many agencies and outlets from around the world are at our fingertips, and a more accurate picture of this evolving pandemic has been available to many of us. Right. With that, I would urge you to be mindful of the one great tragic lesson of history in 1918 with the pandemic is to not allow yourself to be a part of a disinformation campaign and selective information embargoing. right? Fact checked before you post on social media. Please keep a sense of moral understanding in all matters of disease and health. In other words, when you might be fine to continue on your daily lives, there are many, many, many other people who are going to be critically endangered by this. And you need to keep that in mind when you do anything and everything. Check on them and see what you can do for them. Continue to reach out to people, online, keeping your safe distance and different things like that. But please just think about the idea that even if you believe you're immune or at a low tolerance or a low level of threat for this, that many other people are not, right? Finally, even though we have gotten better at hygiene and basically everything for the last 102 years, the timeless message of so many flu posters from that era would still remain today, which is, please wash your hands, okay? Thank you for joining me for this Wait a Minute in History with Mr. Hill, and I'll see y'all next time.